There are winter nights when silence doesn't mean peace. It feels like a cold blade pressing against your throat. Have you ever lived through a moment like that, lying in the dark? When instinct suddenly jolts you awake, your heart pounding, fingers searching for the weapon at your side. And one question burns in your mind. What if someone is already inside your home, in that instant? What would you do? Pull the trigger to survive or hold your hand back, because there might still be a chance for trust. Put yourself in that moment, and you'll realize sometimes an entire life can change because of a single look, a single breath in the dark. And that is where our story begins. Before we step further, I'd like to invite you to join this channel. Hit subscribe so you won't miss the tales of the frontier, harsh, unforgiving, but carrying sparks of hope. And leave a comment. If you were the man in that cabin, would you fire first, or would you listen? Your answer will keep this story alive one more time. The wind outside had been howling for days, lashing across the hard Texas hills, piling snow against the doors and windowsills. The sky fell early, black and heavy. No trace of moon, only the hiss of air cutting through timber and the cabin's frame groaning against it. That night, Jonas Hail woke up. Not the sluggish stir of broken sleep, but the sudden wakefulness of survival instinct, when a man has lived too long with silence. His body learns to know when something isn't right. His fingers twitch toward the Henry rifle beside the bed before his eyes had even opened. His old knee throbbed as always in the cold, reminding him he was no young man anymore. He sat up slowly, eyes sweeping the room. And then he noticed it light. The fire still burned, casting a steady glow against the log walls. But Jonas knew better. He had let the flames die down before lying back. By now, there should have been nothing but cold ash. Instead, the fire lived, fed by someone else's hand. Sweat prickled his neck. His grip tightened on the rifle, finger grazing the trigger guard. But his eyes never left the hearth. There, crouched low, was a figure. Not a ghost, not an animal, a person. A young woman wrapped in his heavy blanket, knees drawn under her, hands trembling as they reached toward the flames, as if doubting whether the warmth was real. Her dark hair hung wet against her shoulders, skin glistening from melted snow. On her lips clung crumbs of his bread, the last loaf he'd left on the table. Jonas's pulse hammered. How long had she been inside? How had she lit the fire, taken food, wrapped herself in his blanket without stirring him? His hand clung to the rifle, but his mind whispered, "Wait. Watch." She wasn't a helpless wanderer. Under the grime and exhaustion, her arms held strength. Her deerskin dress, torn at the seams, spoke of long miles and storms endured. Each bruise, each rip was its own story of survival. Jonas shifted on the cot, the wood creaking. The sound was small, but enough. She turned. Their eyes met a weary man with his hand on a rifle, and a woman whose dark gaze was sharp despite exhaustion. Her eyes flicked to the gun. Then she spoke. Voice raw with thirst. "I thought this place was empty. No trembling, no tears, just plain truth, measured and heavy." Jonas rose carefully, putting weight on his good leg, letting the bad one drag. He didn't answer. Instead, he nudged the kettle with his boot, poured what little was left into a tin cup, and set it on the table, eyes fixed on her. "You want to sit at the table like a person?" His voice was rough as charred wood. She hesitated, then pulled the blanket tighter, and stood. Her limp was slight, her bare foot swollen and cracked from the cold. She sat across from him, wrapped in the blanket, took the cup in both hands, and drank. Slowly, steadily. No thanks, no apology, just the act of surviving. Inside the cabin. The firelight painted their shadows across the walls. Outside. The wind shrieked, between them. The silence stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Jonas's hand stayed on the rifle. The stranger, Alina, as she would later say, never dropped her gaze. She wasn't begging. She was like a cornered animal, wary, unbroken, watching for the next move. And Jonas knew in that instant he stood on a line. He could cast her out into the storm, let the snow swallow her whole, or he could let her stay and accept the danger she carried with her. The choice wasn't just between an open door or a locked one. It was between living in guarded silence or risking it all for the faint warmth of another soul in the heart of winter. Jonas Hail sat in silence, eyes fixed on the stranger clutching the tin cup. The cabin, once familiar and steady, suddenly felt smaller, like every board and nail was waiting to see what he would do. The fire cracked and hissed, throwing light across the woman's face. She was young. Cowboy. Her cheeks hollow, her frame exhausted. The spark of life in her was faint, yet her gaze held no weakness. Jonas had expected pleading, a tearful excuse, a voice breaking with fear. But what came instead made him loosen his grip on the rifle without realizing. "I can cook," she said, voice rough but firm. "I can mend clothes, chop wood. I can warm your bed if you want. I can bear children. I'm strong. I'll be useful. Just don't throw me back out." Her words struck like iron. Not begging, not flirtation, just a stark bargain. A trade of labor, body, and future for shelter. Jonas said nothing at first. Her answer was stripped of shame, stripped of seduction. It was survival in its rawest form, and in that rawness, he felt something shift. There was a pride hidden in her bluntness. "I don't ask for pity. I bargain to live." He exhaled, slow. Then he reached for a second blanket from the cot, walked toward the fire, his bad knee aching. He held it out. "You'll sleep near the fire," he said, voice low. "Steady. No one's throwing you out. But you won't be in my bed either." Her lips trembled once. Not from cold this time, from relief. A faint light flickered in her eyes, quick as kindling catching flame. She took the blanket with chapped hands, wrapped it tight, and knelt back by the hearth. Jonas turned, sat on the edge of his bed. He didn't look at her, only listened as her breathing slowed into something steadier. Yet inside him, something had stirred. He had seen soldiers with that same gaze before, men beaten down, but not broken. Men who refused to quit. Alina had that look. The night dragged heavy. Jonas lay stiff, rifle within reach, eyes refusing to close. But by dawn, pale light filtered through the frost, and he realized he had slept for an hour. Maybe more. What surprised him most, she was still there. Alina lay curled in the blanket, brow furrowed even in sleep, clutching the cloth like it might vanish if she let go. Jonas eased himself upright, knee throbbing, and stirred the fire. The crack of fresh wood woke her. Dark eyes opened, calm, watching him. "You didn't leave," Jonas said, half statement, half question. "I didn't run," she answered simply. Silence hung between them. Then he nodded once. "You said you can cook." She sat up, blanket draped around her shoulders. "I can—" He stepped aside, letting her near the stove. Her movements were stiff but practiced. She stirred oats as if it were habit, not performance. Jonas found himself watching. She didn't look like a beggar, not like someone waiting to be cast aside. She worked like labor itself was the only way to prove she still existed. When the bowls were set on the table, they ate without words, not the heavy silence of suspicion from the night before. This was different, like a truce. Two lives sharing one roof, testing if they could endure the other's presence. Jonas had built this cabin as a fortress of solitude. After fever took his wife and child, he had sworn never to open his life to another soul. Yet here was a stranger with dark eyes steady as stone, refusing to flinch, refusing to beg. To his own surprise, he hadn't sent her back into the snow. To his own surprise, he was listening, and somewhere deep inside, a thin current of warmth slipped beneath the ice. Maybe a stranger could stay, at least for one night. That first morning passed like a strange dream. Inside the little cabin, the fire's warmth and the faint smell of thin porridge softened the bite of winter. Jonas sat at the table, his eyes drifting now and then to the woman across from him. She was still wrapped in the blanket, stirring the pot with steady hands, not waiting for him to tell her what to do. There was no apology, no thanks, only small, practical acts, as if she had always belonged in this place. It unsettled him. Jonas had grown used to silence, the wind rattling through the cracks, the groan of timbers, his own footsteps across the hard floor. Now there were new sounds, the scrape of a spoon against a pan, the sweep of a broom, the rustle of fabric near the hearth, little things. But they pressed into him more than he expected. Days passed, and a rhythm began to form. Alina rose early, fed the fire, heated water, prepared what meals she could from the few stores he kept. Sometimes she found old thread and needles and quietly mended his torn shirts. Jonas watched, half wary, half surprised. He never asked. But the things she did made the cabin feel less hollow. Still, the distance remained. Jonas never let his rifle out of reach. At night it stayed by his bed, and Alina, though present, always carried herself like a wild creature cornered alert, ready, never truly at rest. When their paths crossed close when she handed him a bowl, or when he stepped into the space she was sweeping, there was always a pause, an awkward flicker in the air. Jonas felt his chest tighten, heavy, while Alina would draw the blanket higher across her shoulders, eyes lowered. Not fear exactly, but something softer, shyness, restraint. One evening, Jonas was sharpening a knife by the fire when he heard fabric tear. He looked up. Alina's fingers fumbled at a seam along her shoulder where the deerskin dress had split. The worn edge had slipped low, bearing the curve of her shoulder in the firelight. She flushed faintly, turned quickly back to her stitching. Jonas dropped his gaze to the blade, pretending focus, though his heartbeat betrayed him. Another night. She sat combing her hair with an old brush she had found in a drawer. Dark tangles gave way to long, smooth strands that shimmered against the fire's glow. Jonas saw, then looked away at once. He was afraid of being pulled toward something he had buried years ago. And Alina noticed. Each time his eyes lingered, her face would color faintly, her hands falter for just a second before resuming their work. Shy, but not weak. She would not plead for regard, nor barter what dignity she still held. Day by day, the sharp suspicion dulled into something quieter. Not trust yet, but the silence between them began to feel different. Not the silence of strangers, but the silence of waiting. Jonas asked little. Alina offered little. Yet somehow, two wounded lives began to circle each other, bound inside the same 4 log walls. One morning, Jonas returned from the cattle shed to find the cabin tidier than he had seen in years. Alina had swept the dust, scrubbed the pans, sorted the small heap of supplies. For the first time in a long while, the place carried a woman's hand. Jonas stopped in the doorway, slow, unsure of the feeling creeping into him. Something softening. Something he hadn't expected. That night, he lay awake listening to her breathing near the fire. Not the ragged, guarded breath of their first night, but steady now, even. And his own sleep came easier. The distance wasn't gone. Every glance, every movement still carried a shadow of restraint, a trace of shyness. But beneath it, a fragile thread of trust had begun to weave itself. Not trust given freely, but the kind built from small proofs, a fire already burning in the morning, a shirt neatly mended, a floor cleared of dust. Jonas Hail had never imagined sharing this cabin. Alina had never imagined being allowed to stay. Yet in the heavy grip of winter, their mutual caution, their shy, halting gestures became a bridge, fragile but real, drawing two outcasts into the same quiet rhythm of life. Winter showed no mercy. The storm winds beat against the cabin, snow piling high against the walls as if to bury it whole. Days bled into nights, gray and indistinguishable. And within that bleakness, the fragile truce between Jonas and Alina began to shift not into fracture, but into something opening. One afternoon, Jonas staggered back from the cattle shed, hands stiff, beard crusted with frost. He stumbled through the door, his face pale with cold. Alina, tending the fire, dropped everything and hurried to him. She tugged off his ice-caked coat with urgency. "You'll freeze to death," she said, her voice stripped of its usual reserve. She seized his rigid hands, rubbing them with a rough cloth, then with her own palms until warmth stirred back into the skin. Her hands were smaller, but firm, steady. Jonas said nothing, sitting heavily near the fire, but deep inside. Something long dormant stirred the simple fact of being cared for. In the days that followed, her care became habit. Alina always saved him the hotter portion of the stew. Jonas, in turn, eased his guard and began to share the work, letting her fetch water, split kindling, tend the shed. He no longer waved her away, and when their eyes met by chance, neither looked aside as quickly as before. The shyness was still there, but softened now, warming instead of closing off. One evening, the firelight flickered across the cabin as Jonas honed a blade. Alina came forward with a shirt in her hands, the tear mended neatly with careful stitches. She held it out, cheeks touched with a faint red glow. Jonas took it, and for an instant, his fingers brushed hers. Both paused, breath catching, a brief touch, yet enough to spark a warmth greater than the fire could give. After that, small touches returned, often fingers meeting as a bowl was passed, his hand steadying her when ice slicked the step. No words. But the silence itself carried something undeniable, each heart aware of its own quickening. The night of change came while the storm howled fiercest. Jonas sat heavy before the fire, fatigue carved deep in his face. Alina, chores finished, sat opposite him. The fire cast their shadows against the log walls, the outline of a weathered man, solitary too long, and a woman scarred, but unbroken. Jonas spoke first, voice low, ragged. I'd grown used to the cold, to the emptiness, but I never thought someone would still choose to sit here with me. Alina raised her eyes to his. No more evasions, no more fear, only a steady gaze, firm as an anchor. She answered quietly. I'm not here just because I fear the snow. I'm here because I want to be. The silence broke. Jonas reached out, calloused fingers brushing her cheek. Alina closed her eyes, not pulling away. The touch lingered, trembled, and then his lips found hers. Careful, hesitant, but real. A kiss not of demand, but of recognition. When they parted, neither spoke. Jonas only held her gaze, then rose and offered his hand. She took it. He led her to the bed that had stood empty for years. That night, the cabin held more than one breath. Two rhythms rose and fell together, warm against the storm outside. Jonas Hail, once sealed in silence and grief, did not sleep alone. And Alina, once treated as something to be bartered, felt herself chosen, not forced, not pitied, but wanted. Beyond the walls, the blizzard still raged, but inside, a fragile warmth had taken root. No longer just survival, something greater had begun. The belief that hearts could draw close again, even after losses that once seemed beyond repair. The next morning, a pale gray light slipped through the frost-covered window. The storm had quieted, leaving a fragile stillness hanging over the cabin. Jonas woke slowly, aware of the warmth beside him. For the first time in years, he had not woken to emptiness. Instead, he heard the steady rhythm of another breath against his chest. Alina lay there, dark hair spilling across his shoulder, her small hand resting lightly over his heart, as if afraid to lose its anchor. The sight struck Jonas harder than any winter wind. He had believed such mornings were gone forever, yet here it was, real and quiet. He rose carefully, feet touching the cold wooden floor, pulling on his coat to stir the fire. When he turned back, he saw Alina waking. She sat up, blanket drawn across her shoulders, her eyes soft with sleep yet calmer than he had ever seen them. Gone was the frantic look of a cornered stranger. What lingered now was something steadier, as if she belonged. Jonas studied her a moment, then opened a chest at the foot of his bed. From it he pulled an old shirt, still clean, and placed it on the table. His voice was low but firm. "Wear this. Cut it down if you need to." Alina rose slowly and took it in her hands. Her fingers traced the fabric, her eyes catching on the gift. She knew it was not just clothing. It was a wordless sign. "Stay. This is your place now." As she dressed, Jonas turned away, facing the frosted window. He listened to the quiet rustle of fabric, the small pause in her breathing. Then her voice came. Steady. Deliberate Jonas. "I don't want to be only a body in this house." He turned back. She stood there in his shirt, wide at the shoulders, the hem brushing her thighs. Yet her eyes were unflinching, demanding his answer. He stepped closer, his words falling like an oath. "You never were." Her breath shook, not from fear, but from the weight of hearing a man deny the shame others had placed on her. For the first time in years, the burden eased. In the days that followed, the cabin itself began to change. Alina moved through it with quiet purpose, mending curtains, sweeping dust from corners, straightening shelves Jonas had ignored for years. Every small act sowed new life into walls that had once held only silence. Jonas changed, too. He rose earlier, shared the chores, let her walk beside him to the shed. His silence no longer felt like a wall, but something shared quiet. Yes, but no longer lonely. And so, slowly, a new beginning took root. They didn't speak of distant futures. They lived each day as it came, working side by side, eating from the same pot, warming by the same fire. Yet within those simple rhythms, hope returned. One evening, Jonas stepped in from the cold to find Alina by the hearth, stitching a small scrap of cloth. She looked up, her eyes catching the glow of firelight. "This cabin doesn't feel like a shelter anymore," she said softly. "It feels like a home." Jonas stood still, letting the words settle deep. He had built these walls to keep people out. Now, because of her, they held something else entirely. Winter had not ended. The storms could still return. But inside them both, another season had already begun, the season of hope, of a new life taking shape. That night, as they sat together by the fire, Jonas spoke. "I can't promise much, but I promise this: you'll never be cast out again." Alina's lips curved into the faintest smile, small, but bright enough to warm the whole room. And so, in that small cabin on the frozen frontier, two people who had once known only loss and survival found something greater: the chance to begin again, and the belief that they were worthy of a home and a future. The snow began to melt, the ground softening beneath the first trickles of spring. Streams whispered down the hillsides, carrying the sound of change. Jonas stood on the porch, breathing in the damp air heavy with thawing earth. He knew this moment would come, the season when winter could no longer hide the cabin, when the roads would open and people would return. Alina knew it too. She sat on the step, her hair neatly braided, wearing Jonas's shirt refitted to her frame. She looked out at the distance, calm, but with a shadow of unease. "When they see me here," she said quietly, "they'll ask questions." Jonas glanced at her, his voice steady as iron. "Then we answer. If they stare, let them stare. You're here, that's the truth. Nothing to hide." The first trip into town was silent. Jonas led the horse at an even pace. Alina walked beside him, her chin high, though her fingers clenched the fabric of her shirt until her knuckles turned pale. At the town's edge, heads began to turn. Men paused in their work. Women pulled children closer. Whispers cut the air like a knife away. He brought one home. Jonas halted at the well, lifting his eyes directly to the man who muttered loudest. His stare was cold, unwavering. The man shifted, dropped his gaze. Alina drew a slow breath. This wasn't noisy protection. It was a declaration, simple, unflinching. He wasn't ashamed. Inside the trading post, the merchant's brows drew tight when he saw her. His eyes lingered too long. But Jonas set a bundle of hides on the counter. "Flour, salt, nails," he said flatly, when the merchant looked toward Alina, as if about to speak something sharp. Jonas cut him off. "Her name is Alina. That's all you need to know." The silence stretched until the man muttered and filled the order. Alina's hands trembled, but inside her chest, something unexpected flickered. For years, she had been called many names: burden, trouble, property. Now, in the middle of scornful eyes, one man spoke her name with steadiness, as if that alone was enough. "On the way back," she whispered, "they'll keep talking." Jonas set down the sack of goods when they reached the cabin, turning to her. "Let them at. We don't live by their words." The rumors spread fast across the hills. Some shrugged, some sneered, some laughed. But Jonas never hid. He and Alina walked the markets, traded and bartered like any couple. Every sideways glance only seemed to make him stand taller, his hand steady against her back. Silent proof she's here. With me. That's all that matters. Alina, too, began to change. At first, she lowered her eyes, heart pounding at every whisper. But little by little, she began to hold her head high. Her dark gaze no longer wavered. Each time Jonas's hand touched her shoulder in quiet reassurance, she knew she was no longer alone. One evening, stacking wood by the porch, Jonas said, "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone, but not now. If anyone asks, I'll tell them plain yes. This is my woman. Nothing more needs saying." Alina froze, lips trembling before she found her voice. "I never thought I'd hear a man speak of me that way. Not hidden, not bartered, just named." Jonas set his hand over hers. Slow and sure. Not named. Truth. Outside. Spring crept into the hills, inside the cabin. Another season had already begun, the season of courage. They no longer hid. They no longer lived in secrecy. Together, they stood in the open, willing to face every stare, every whisper, with a simple, unshakable declaration. This is us. Spring spread across the Texas hills, painting the fields in new green. Snow had melted. Streams carried the sound of life returning, and the earth smelled damp and alive again, after months of nothing but howling winds and the crack of firewood. Jonas Hail stood on the porch, looking out toward the horizon, feeling something stir in his chest. A season had ended not just in the land, but inside him. Alina stepped out from the cabin, her dark hair neatly braided, her eyes calm and steady. She no longer looked like the desperate woman who had crept into his cabin on a freezing night. Now she moved as though the house itself knew her steps. Yet there was something new in her expression that morning, a quiet resolve, wrapped in hesitation. "Jonas," she said softly, though her voice did not waver. "I have something to tell you." He turned, waiting. Alina placed a hand gently over her stomach, still flat, not yet showing, but enough to steal his breath. "I think I'm with child," she said. The air stilled. Jonas stood frozen, not in fear, but in the weight of it. Slowly, he stepped closer, his rough hand covering hers. "Mine?" he asked, searching her eyes. She nodded once, her gaze unflinching. "Ours." Jonas breathed deep, as though the years of grief and silence cracked open at last. For the first time since Sarah and the child he buried long ago. He felt no dread, only certainty, only life. "Then this is our home," he said firmly. "Yours, and the child's." Alina trembled, tears slipping down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of release. For years, she had believed she was nothing more than a body traded, a burden to be cast aside. Now she stood as a wife in truth, a mother-to-be, and above all, someone chosen. Word spread quickly in town. When Jonas and Alina returned to the market, walking side by side, heads turned. Whispers followed them like shadows. Some sneered, some scoffed, Some looked away, uneasily. Jonas didn't flinch. He walked straight through the market, his hand resting steady at the small of Alina's back. And when a man muttered something cruel, Jonas turned, met his eyes, and held the silence until the man looked down. No excuses, no shame, just truth, unhidden. Alina's hand sometimes trembled at her side, but each step grew stronger. She was no longer a woman cast out to survive winter nights. She was carrying life, their life. And for the first time, she believed her body was not broken, not worthless, but sacred. The cabin changed again. Jonas worked harder, chopping more wood, stacking more stores. He was no longer living just to make it through the next storm. He was preparing for her, for the child. Alina, too, stitched scraps of cloth into tiny garments, her fingers careful, steady. Some evenings Jonas would watch her bent over the table, needle glinting in firelight, and feel peace in a way he hadn't known in years. One night, with the fire burning low, Alina leaned into his shoulder, whispering, "I thought I'd never belong anywhere again. But now," she guided his hand to her belly, "now I do." Jonas tightened his hand there, answering simply, "You belong here, you and the child. And to you listening now, this is where the story finds its heart. A man who thought his life was over now walks with purpose. A woman who once was bartered like a possession now carries new life, held with honor. Together, they stand not hidden, not ashamed, but side by side, facing whatever comes. If you followed them through suspicion and silence, through storms and whispers, this is the reward: a new family, fragile yet full of hope, born in the harshest land. So let me ask you, if you were Jonas, broken by loss, would you have the courage to open your heart again if you were Alina, scarred by betrayal? Would you believe yourself worthy of a new beginning? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share what you would do. And if you believe Jonas and Alina deserve this chance, support their story by subscribing so their journey doesn't end here, but carries on with you, because there will be more trials ahead. The stairs, the gossip, the weight of survival on the frontier. Jonas will need strength to shield his new family. Alina will need courage to prove she is more than just Jonas's woman, that she is a partner, a mother, and a heart of this home. And together, they must prepare for the child who will be born into this unforgiving land. This story isn't finished. It has only begun. In the thaw of spring, in a cabin once meant for one, life has returned, a woman, a man, a child yet unborn, and for Jonas Hail, who once thought silence would be his last companion, there is now warmth, purpose, and reason to live. He found his future not in solitude, but in family. And maybe, just maybe, it reminds us all, no matter how deep the loss, each of us deserves a chance to begin again.